Let's settle this in front of everyone, Dad said, sliding a DNA kit past the mashed potatoes. 27 people laughed. My sister started recording. I stared right back. Great, but we do it court grade. Over the next 3 weeks, the results silenced him. It did not just prove I was his biological child, it detonated the succession plan, the company buyout, and years of family lies. I never had to scream. I only needed paperwork. My name is Ember Watson, and I do not rattle easily. I am 34 years old, and my days are spent as a senior fraud analyst for Gray Line Benefit Systems in Seattle. In my line of work, you learn very quickly that emotions are liabilities. People cry. People scream. People swear they are telling the truth. But the numbers never lie. I process reality through evidence, paper trails, and undeniable facts. It is a skill set that makes me exceptionally good at my job. It is also the exact skill set that made me the wrong person to humiliate at a family dinner. The stage was set at my father's sprawling lakefront estate near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, every year. The Watson family Thanksgiving was less of a holiday and more of a corporate retreat mixed with a theatrical performance. There were nearly 30 guests crammed around a custom-built oak dining table, ranging from board members of Watson Ridge Outfitters to distant cousins who liked to hover near the money. Calvin Watson, my father and the founder of the aforementioned Pacific Northwest retail empire, sat at the head of the table. He was a man who breathed oxygen but lived entirely on attention. We were exactly halfway through the roasted turkey and the cranberry sauce when the box made its appearance. Calvin reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a brightly colored cardboard box, and sent it sliding down the length of the polished wood. It stopped perfectly beside my plate, right next to the mashed potatoes. It was a commercial DNA testing kit. The brightly colored lettering promised to uncover my true ancestry. "Let us settle this in front of everyone," Calvin announced, his booming voice cutting through the ambient chatter. "Once and for all, let us see if you actually belong to the Watson bloodline." A chorus of laughter erupted around the table. At least 24 people chuckled. Accustomed to Calvin's toxic brand of humor, for years, he had used my physical differences as a punchline. I did not possess the signature Watson blonde hair or the pale blue eyes. My hair was dark, my features sharper, my coloring different. To Calvin, this was an endless source of amusement, a way to subtly undermine my legitimacy in the family hierarchy during every major gathering. Across the table, my golden child sister, Blair Watson, who was 37 and the executive vice president of the company, let out a delighted gasp. She immediately raised her smartphone, angling the camera to capture my humiliation. I could practically see the gears turning in her head. Already drafting the caption to post the video into the massive family group chat, Blair was the face of Watson Ridge, beloved by local press and investors alike. And she thrived on moments where she could look down from her pedestal. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the predictable reaction. They expected tears. They expected me to throw my napkin down, push my chair back, and storm out of the dining room in a dramatic display of female fragility. They wanted a show. I did not give them one. I did not blink. I did not let a single muscle in my jaw tighten. Instead, I picked up the brightly colored box, examined the cheap cellophane wrapping, and set it back down. I looked straight down the length of the table, locking eyes with the man who had spent his entire life trying to make me feel small. "Great," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying cleanly over the fading laughter. "But if we are doing this, we are not using a mail-in toy. We do it court grade." The laughter stopped. A heavy, absolute silence slammed into the room, so thick you could hear the crackle of the fireplace in the adjacent living room. "Court grade," I repeated, enunciating every syllable. "That means a legally admissible laboratory. We go in person. They check our government identification. A professional technician swabs us. We sign affidavits under penalty of perjury. There will be a documented, unbroken chain of custody for the samples from the moment they leave our mouths to the moment the certified results are printed. No room for error. No room for disputes. Calvin stared at me. The smug, self-satisfied grin was still pasted on his face, but the corners of his eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation. He was trying to calculate if I was bluffing. In his mind, I was just the rebellious daughter who had refused to join the family business, the one who chose a boring corporate job in Seattle over the glamorous outdoor retail empire he had built. He thought he held all the cards. He thought his audience would protect him because he was completely addicted to the spotlight, and because nearly 30 pairs of eyes were watching him wait for his next move. His massive ego made the decision for him. He could not back down now, not when he had initiated the challenge. "Fine," Calvin barked, slamming his hand flat on the table, trying to project absolute dominance. "You want legal, we will do legal. We will see exactly what the paperwork says. Ember." "Excellent," I replied, pulling my phone from my pocket. "I will have the consent forms drafted and sent to your email by tomorrow morning. I expect you to sign them." I did not raise my voice, but the atmosphere in the dining room had irrevocably fractured. The lighting felt harsher, the air felt thinner. What had started as a cruel dinner table stunt had just mutated into a binding legal challenge. There would be records. There would be permanent, unalterable timestamps. There would be consequences that extended far beyond a Thanksgiving punchline. Blair slowly lowered her phone, the screen going dark. The distant cousins suddenly found their wine glasses intensely fascinating. Calvin picked up his fork, but his knuckles were stark white. He had wanted a joke, a fleeting moment of superiority to remind everyone that he was the absolute monarch of the Watson bloodline. He had no idea what he had just set into motion. He had no idea that I already knew exactly how to dismantle a fraudulent system from the inside out. This is the story of how an arrogant man handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. It is the story of how a single, petty joke at a Thanksgiving dinner contained the spark that would burn a multi-million-dollar family empire straight to the ground in a matter of a few short weeks. And it all started because he forgot one fundamental rule about me. I never play games. I only build cases. Watson Ridge Outfitters was not just a company. It was a regional religion. With 62 locations stretching from the wet forests of Oregon up through the rugged trails of Washington and Idaho, it catered to people who wanted to spend $400 on a waterproof jacket just to walk their dog. My father built it from a single storefront into a retail juggernaut. Currently, he was in the final, delicate stages of selling a massive strategic stake to North Hollow Retail Partners, a private equity firm based out of New York. The deal was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was poised to turn our family from locally wealthy to generationally untouchable. For my father, the business and his DNA were indistinguishable. He was deeply obsessed with the concept of legacy. He did not just want an heir, he wanted a monarch to carry the torch. The word bloodline was his absolute favorite noun. He used it during quarterly earnings calls, during interviews with business magazines, and while carving roasts at Sunday dinners. To be a Watson was to be part of a superior genetic and corporate strain. It was a brand identity coded into human cells. At least according to him, Blair fit this mythology perfectly. As the executive vice president, she was the manufactured face of the brand, with her bright blonde hair, athletic build, and effortless, camera-ready smile. She looked exactly like the women featured in the Watson Ridge catalogs. She spent her days attending charity galas, shaking hands with local politicians, and securing favorable write-ups in regional newspapers. She was a phenomenal mascot, entirely loyal to my father and completely uninterested in the gritty, complicated mechanics of how the company actually processed its revenue. She signed whatever was placed on her desk as long as it had our father's approval. My relationship with my father was a completely different landscape. Our conflict was not rooted in some dark, traumatic childhood abuse. I had a comfortable, privileged upbringing. The real war between us only ignited over the past 10 years. Right around the time I turned 24 and flatly refused a cushy, meaningless title at Watson Ridge, I wanted to build my own life, relying on my own intellect rather than my last name. My career in fraud analysis gave me a sharp eye for systemic failures, which naturally made me a massive thorn in his side. Several times over the past 4 years, I had reviewed the limited financial disclosures I had access to as a minority shareholder. I saw glaring operational risks. I noticed troubling inventory cycles, where merchandise seemed to shift between warehouses without generating actual point-of-sale revenue, and compliance vulnerabilities that could easily derail a serious external audit. Whenever I brought these concerns to the family board, I was swiftly and aggressively shut down. My father would dismiss my data with a wave of his hand, claiming I simply lacked the Watson spirit. He insisted that the retail business was about gut instinct and outdoor soul, not the cold spreadsheets I was used to analyzing. When dismissing my professional opinion was not enough, he would inevitably weaponize my biology. It was his favorite debate tactic. Whenever I pushed too hard for transparency or questioned a strategic decision regarding our expansion, he would lean back in his leather chair, look at my dark hair and sharp features, and sigh heavily. He would say that I just did not see the world the way the rest of the family did. He would make subtle, insidious comments about how I must have inherited the traits of some distant, forgotten ancestor, effectively framing me as an outsider in my own home. It was never a direct accusation of infidelity against my mother, but rather a constant, calculated campaign to undermine my legitimacy and diminish my voting power in family matters. He made sure everyone in the room knew I was the odd one out. Through all of this, my mother, Marianne, perfected the art of strategic blindness. She was not a cruel woman, and she never actively participated in the mockery. However, she also never stopped it. Whenever my father launched into a monologue about the purity of the Watson bloodline or made a pointed joke about my appearance, she would smoothly change the subject. She would ask someone to pass the wine or comment on the weather outside. She consistently chose the superficial piece of the household over defending the truth or protecting her youngest daughter. For her, preserving the illusion of the perfect corporate family was worth any amount of quiet indignity I had to endure. She wanted the magazine cover life, and she was willing to pay for it with my credibility. But looking back at the current state of affairs, the puzzle pieces began to lock into a very specific, terrifying picture. My father did not do anything by accident. The public humiliation at the family gathering was not a spontaneous burst of cruel humor. The North Hollow acquisition was entering its most critical phase. Whispers had been circulating through my professional network that my father was quietly working with his legal team to roll out a brand new inheritance and voting rights structure before the ink on the buyout dried. This new trust structure was reportedly designed to consolidate absolute control within the company. I knew exactly what kind of language he would try to embed into those documents. He was planning to rewrite the rules of the family empire, and to do that smoothly. He needed a legal pretext to cut the dead weight. He needed a reason to push the dark-haired, questioning daughter out of the boardroom for good, stripping me of any ability to stall the sale or demand an independent audit. The public challenge was never just a bad joke. It was the opening maneuver in a highly calculated legal strategy to secure a biological excuse to rewrite my future. He intended to use the results of a commercial ancestry kit to prove I had no right to question the Watson legacy. He just did not realize he was handing the ultimate weapon to a woman who dismantled fraudulent systems for a living. Calvin tried to salvage his punchline, desperate to keep the upper hand. "Come on," he chuckled, waving a heavy hand toward the elaborate floral centerpiece. "It is just a little fun, just so the whole family knows who the real Watson is." The loyalists at the table eagerly latched onto his cue. A few aunts and uncles offered relieved. Sycophantic laughter. The pendulum of power swung heavily back toward the head of the table. He was the patriarch. He dictated the weather in the room, and he had decided the forecast was light-hearted mockery. I did not wait for tomorrow morning to handle the paperwork. I realized instantly that giving him 12 hours of breathing room meant giving him time to consult his corporate attorneys. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer, retrieved my phone, and tapped the screen to wake it. "Actually," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute chill of a sterile corporate boardroom. "Let us not wait. Let us handle the administrative work right now. while we are all gathered here. I navigated directly to the clinical portal of the premier forensic laboratory in the state of Washington. I began reading the intake requirements out loud, making sure my projection reached the furthest corners of the dining room. Requires 2 forms of government-issued identification, requires a sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury, requires an independent technician to break the seal on the collection equipment. Results are admissible in state and federal court for matters involving probate, asset distribution, and fiduciary disputes. The temperature in the room plummeted. The nervous, sycophantic laughter died immediately in their throats. These were wealthy people. They inherently understood the dangerous vocabulary of wealth. When you introduce words like probate and asset distribution over a platter of roasted vegetables, the game fundamentally changes. It was no longer a $99 novelty box bought off the internet. It was a binding legal instrument. My father's jaw tightened, the smugness drained from his face, replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. My thumbs flew across the digital keyboard. I drafted a swift, highly specific email to his primary executive address. The text detailed his explicit, uncoerced agreement to submit to a legally binding, chain of custody biological test, the results of which would be shared unredacted with both parties and filed securely. "I just sent it to you," I told him, locking my eyes onto his. "Open your inbox. Reply with your full legal name and the exact words. I consent and agree to the parameters." Blair let out an exaggerated, theatrical sigh, tossing her expensive linen napkin onto her plate. "God, you are making such a massive scene out of absolutely nothing. You are always doing the most just for attention. It was a joke. Stop being so exhausting and just eat your dinner." Her interference was exactly the catalyst I needed. Blair's condescension acted like a high-voltage cattle prod to our father's pride. He could not look like he was backing down from his exhausting, dramatic daughter in front of his favored golden child. He snatched his phone off the table. He glared at me, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "You want to waste your money proving what we all already know, fine. I will sign your ridiculous little permission slip if it will finally shut you up." He tapped aggressively on his screen, down the far end of the table. I noticed 2 of our younger cousins discreetly holding up their smartphones. The camera flashes were disabled, but the recording interface was unmistakable. They were filming him. They were capturing the exact moment the great patriarch angrily consented to a binding legal challenge, thinking it would be hilarious material for their private group chats later that evening. They thought it was just messy family gossip. I knew it was airtight. Legally admissible video evidence of consent without duress. My phone chimed brightly. The notification popped up on my lock screen. A direct reply from his verified executive email account. "I consent and agree to the parameters. Calvin Richard Watson." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not offer a single word of triumph. I locked my phone and slid it back into my blazer pocket. I stood up. I pushed my heavy wooden chair in quietly, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor. I did not offer any tearful goodbyes. I did not storm out in a predictable, emotional rage. I simply picked up my wool coat from the back of the chair and walked away from the table, leaving a plate of untouched food and 27 deeply uncomfortable people behind me. The gravel of the sprawling driveway crunched heavily under my boots as I walked out to my car. The freezing Idaho air hit my lungs, sharp and clarifying. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and turned the heater up to its highest setting. Then, I went to work. I was no longer the marginalized daughter sitting at a toxic dinner table. I was a fraud investigator with a fresh, highly volatile case file. I opened my encrypted laptop resting on the passenger seat. I created a secure, isolated folder on my private cloud drive. I uploaded the consent email immediately. I captured the digital headers, the routing information, and the metadata to ensure the timestamp was irrefutable. I saved the IP address logs linking the email directly to the local network of his estate. 45 minutes into my dark drive back toward the interstate, my phone screen illuminated brightly in the cup holder. It was the massive family group chat. Notifications began rolling in rapidly. one after another. Did that actually just happen? DNA night at the Watsons? Someone send the video of Uncle Calvin typing furiously. A video clip appeared in the chat. It was perfectly framed by one of the cousins, showing my father clearly verbalizing his agreement while angrily pressing send on his phone. The audio was crisp. The context was undeniable. They were laughing at me, treating my supposed humiliation as the premium entertainment of the holiday season. I pulled the sedan onto the shoulder of the dark, empty road. The hazard lights blinked a rhythmic, amber glow against the surrounding pine trees. I downloaded the video file directly to my secure folder, backing it up across 3 different, geographically separated servers. I opened the messaging application. I read the barrage of laughing emojis, the sarcastic comments, and the endless stream of family inside jokes at my expense. I kept my response perfectly concise. Thanks. Keep everything. I shifted the car back into drive and merged onto the highway, the digital trail already cementing the foundation of his absolute ruin. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of an accredited forensic testing facility in downtown Seattle. The environment was aggressively sterile, smelling faintly of industrial cleaning supplies and cold paper. I approached the front desk, bypassing the standard ancestry pamphlets, and requested their highest tier of legal verification, a certified technician, a woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, escorted me into a stark white examination room. The protocol was rigid. She demanded 2 forms of government identification. I handed over my driver's license and my passport. She scrutinized the holograms, photocopied the documents, and placed the copies into a thick manila folder. Next came the sworn affidavits. I signed my full legal name in blue ink across 4 separate pages, acknowledging that providing a false sample constituted perjury under federal law. When it was time for the actual collection, she opened a factory-sealed buccal swab directly in front of my eyes. The process took precisely 30 seconds. I watched as she placed the plastic applicator into a specialized vial, locked the cap, and secured it with a tamper-evident barcode sticker. She handed me a receipt that guaranteed an unbroken chain of custody. The sample was now a legally admissible artifact. I drove directly from the clinic to the headquarters of Gray Line Benefit Systems. No detour, no venting, no collapse. I walked straight to the break room, poured 2 cups of black coffee, and headed into the office of Tessa Moreno. Tessa was a fellow fraud analyst and the sharpest investigator on our floor. We spent our days tracing shell corporations and exposing falsified expense reports. She understood the architecture of a lie better than anyone I knew. I sat across from her desk and gave her a completely objective, chronological rundown of the weekend. My voice stayed level. I was not there for sympathy. Tessa listened quietly, her dark eyes tracking my every word. When I finished, she took a slow sip of her coffee. "Let the facts speak," she told me, her tone perfectly even. When people build an empire on a narrative rather than reality, they always leave structural flaws. Do not try to correct his narrative with emotion. Let him build his trap, and let the documentation spring it. 5 days after the turkey had been carved, the true motive behind the dining room theater finally revealed itself. The notification chimed on my phone at exactly 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was a mass communication sent from my father's executive email account. The recipient list included the family board, the senior executive team, and the lead external legal counsel for Watson Ridge Outfitters. The subject line was dense and bureaucratic, reading Future Structuring and Legacy Voting Trust Draft. I opened the attached document and began to read through the dense legal jargon. Buried deep within the 4th section of the proposal was the poison pill. My father was announcing a complete restructuring of the family voting shares, a necessary step, he claimed, to streamline decision-making ahead of the massive North Hollow acquisition. However, the new trust explicitly stated that voting rights, board presence, and future dividend distributions would be strictly limited to the lineal descendants and verified biological issue of the founder. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The public humiliation was never just a petty, drunken joke. It was the prologue to a corporate coup. My father knew that an impending audit by the private equity firm would give me a massive platform to voice my concerns about the company's financial discrepancies. He needed a legally defensible mechanism to strip me of my voting shares and remove me from the board entirely before the buyout entered the final stages. He was planning to weaponize the long-standing family rumor about my parentage, using the results of a mail-in toy kit to justify my exclusion from the new legacy trust. He wanted to legally erase me to protect his deal. I immediately picked up my phone and scheduled an emergency consultation with Nora Kincaid. Nora was a formidable senior partner at Kincaid Mercer, a boutique litigation firm that handled complex corporate disputes and high-net-worth estate conflicts. Sitting in her minimalist corner office on the 40th floor, surrounded by panoramic views of the Seattle skyline, I laid out the printed email, the digital receipts, and the time-stamped video files from the holiday weekend. Nora adjusted her tortoiseshell glasses and read through the proposed trust language twice. A sharp, predatory smile touched the corners of her mouth. "He thinks he is staging a brilliant tactical maneuver," Nora said, tapping her gold pen against the printed phrase biological issue. "He is laying the groundwork to freeze you out of the transaction based on a biological threshold, but his arrogance just blinded him to basic contract law. If he insists on writing this specific bloodline requirement into the foundational charter of the new trust, he binds the company to objective genetic reality. If your court-grade test returns a positive match, he cannot exclude you without violating his own newly minted corporate governance. Any attempt to remove you after a positive legal result would be grounds for a massive shareholder discrimination lawsuit that would instantly terrify his private equity buyers. He is essentially giving you the keys to the castle, assuming you will never have the courage to put the key in the lock." Nora leaned back in her chair and asked me the standard attorney question. She wanted to know my number. She wanted to know exactly what percentage of the buyout or what monetary settlement I was aiming to extract from the situation. I looked her in the eye and shook my head. My goal was never to steal the company or extort a massive payout. I earned a comfortable salary. I owned my own home. My motivation was much colder. I wanted to permanently dismantle the insidious, decade-long lie that I was an imposter in my own family. I wanted to stop a man from using my existence as a convenient corporate loophole. I wanted the absolute, unvarnished truth recorded into the permanent legal architecture of the Watson Empire. That evening, I sat alone in my dark apartment, the blue light of my laptop screen illuminating the kitchen island. I opened my encrypted hard drive. It was time to organize the digital war room. I right-clicked, creating a new, heavily secured master directory. I typed the title slowly, feeling the immense gravity of the files I was about to store inside. I created one master directory, Watson Timeline, with encrypted subfolders for consents, trust drafts, test records, and evidence. I meticulously dragged the laboratory receipts, the downloaded video clips, the time-stamped email threads, and the drafted trust proposal into their designated subfolders. I was fully prepared for a brutal conflict, but I had no intention of fighting it with raised voices or emotional outbursts. I was going to fight him with irrefutable paper, and I was going to win. The notification from the Seattle laboratory arrived on a Thursday morning, precisely 13 days after the holiday dinner. It bypassed my standard inbox and landed directly in the encrypted portal I had set up for the case. I was sitting at my desk at Grayline Benefit Systems, surrounded by the hum of the corporate fraud division, when the alert flashed across my screen. I clicked the secure link, entered my secondary authentication codes, and opened the 24-page digital document. I bypassed the intricate genetic charts and the dense scientific methodology. Scrolling directly to the final legal conclusion on the last page, the text was stark, printed in a heavy, uncompromising font. Probability of paternity is 99.99%. Calvin Richard Watson is the biological father of the tested subject. I sat back in my ergonomic mesh chair and stared at the glowing monitor. I read the conclusion 3 more times. I did not cry. I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming rush of validation or familial warmth. The little girl inside me who had spent 3 decades wondering why she was treated like a stranger had died a long time ago. In her place was a senior investigator analyzing a critical piece of newly acquired evidence. I felt the cold, heavy weight of a loaded weapon being placed directly into my hand. This document was never about my personal identity. I always knew exactly who I was. This was about leverage. It was an irrefutable, legally binding asset. Later that afternoon, I sat across from Nora Kincaid in her high-rise office, through the standard discovery channels related to minority shareholder rights. Nora had managed to secure the latest, highly confidential draft of the new corporate trust. It was significantly thicker than the preliminary proposal. Nora slid the heavy, leather-bound document across her polished mahogany desk. She had highlighted the key operative terms in bright, neon yellow ink. Biological issue. Direct lineal descendants. Verified bloodline. The language was practically dripping with my father's desperate obsession with genetic purity. He was building an entire corporate governance structure around the concept of DNA. Nora tapped the date printed on my certified lab results and then tapped the blank signature line on the final page of the trust draft. "Here is the absolute beauty of timing," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur of professional appreciation. "These lab results now exist in the real world as a certified, time-stamped legal fact. If your father formally executes this trust, creating a structure deliberately designed to exclude non-biological children. While a legally binding document already proves you are his biological child, he is walking himself directly into a massive liability trap." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind her tortoiseshell frames. "Attempting to freeze you out of the North Hollow buyout under the guise of this bloodline clause, after the initiation of a formal genetic test, constitutes an egregious act of bad faith. It is a textbook breach of fiduciary duty and blatant discrimination against a minority shareholder. If he signs this, the private equity buyers will instantly panic. It would be entirely indefensible in a court of equity." I looked at the 2 documents resting on the desk. The absolute instinct of a wounded human being would be to immediately forward the lab results to the entire family group chat, demanding a public apology, demanding instant vindication. But the instinct of a seasoned fraud analyst is entirely different. You never interrupt the suspect while they are in the middle of signing the forged check. You wait patiently until they hand it directly to the bank teller. "We do not tell him," I said, my voice perfectly level. "We do not tell anyone. We let him present the trust. We let him put his entire legacy on the line, operating on the arrogant assumption that I am going to fail his little test." Nora smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that perfectly mirrored my own internal state. "Exactly." The next morning, I was pouring black coffee in the gray line break room when Tessa walked in. She leaned against the granite counter, studying my face with the careful scrutiny of a fellow investigator. I had given her a brief update on the test results before our morning briefing. She was looking for the subtle cracks, the inevitable emotional toll of having a father who required a sterile laboratory to acknowledge your existence. "Does it hurt?" Tessa asked softly, keeping her voice low so the other analysts would not hear. "Seeing the proof in black and white, knowing he put you through all of this public humiliation just to try and steal your shares." I looked down at the dark liquid in my ceramic mug. I thought about the decades of subtle jabs, the calculated exclusion, the constant, suffocating feeling of being an uninvited guest in my own life. I thought about the sheer cruelty required to turn a daughter into a corporate loophole. "Pain is no longer the issue," I told her, my tone devoid of any tremor or hesitation. "Now it is the record." Meanwhile, the digital circus continued unabated. My phone vibrated constantly throughout the week. The family group chat had evolved into a breeding ground for cruel, unchecked speculation. Cousins posted ridiculous memes about mailmen and pool boys. Blair sent a long, incredibly passive-aggressive message about how true family is about loyalty to the brand, not just biology, subtly hedging her bets while still maintaining her absolute air of superiority. Various aunts and uncles made thinly veiled, cowardly comments about my mother's past social life. I read every single message. I did not type a single reply. I simply pressed the side buttons on my smartphone, capturing the screen. Every joke, every meme, every insult was meticulously archived and uploaded directly to my secure, encrypted folder. They thought they were participating in a private, hilarious inside joke. They did not realize they were actively building a permanent, time-stamped exhibit of their own malice and prejudice. The waiting game ended exactly 14 days before the North Hollow acquisition was scheduled to close. The notification arrived at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a formal calendar invitation sent to all voting shareholders and executive family members. The subject line was uncompromising and deeply formal: final review of legacy trust and voting distribution. The location was set for the downtown offices of Ellis Rowan, our longtime family corporate counsel. The attached description explicitly noted that all parties were required to have their legal representation present, as this specific structure would be finalized and notarized to clear the path for the private equity signing phase. I clicked the green button to accept the invitation immediately. I forwarded the calendar details directly to Nora. My father had finally built his stage. He had assembled his captive audience. He had written an entire corporate script that was completely dependent on my humiliation and my eventual erasure. He just had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the final act in my briefcase. The pressure cooker began whistling exactly 48 hours before the scheduled family meeting. It started with a phone call from Blair. Her name flashing on my screen was a rare occurrence, usually reserved for times she needed me to coordinate a gift for our mother. I answered on the third ring. Her voice poured through the speaker, adopting that specific, practiced warmth she used on local news anchors. She asked me to keep my temper in check. She said the North Hollow deal was in a highly delicate phase and begged me not to embarrass our father. I let her speak for 4 uninterrupted minutes, noting how she effortlessly framed me as the volatile variable, completely ignoring who had slid the test across the table in the first place. I gave her a non-committal hum and ended the call. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated with a direct text message from Calvin. The words were clipped, authoritative, and entirely devoid of warmth. He demanded that I arrive on time tomorrow. He wrote that I needed to come and listen so I would finally understand my permanent position in the family moving forward. It was his classic pattern of control, designed to make me feel small before I even walked into the room. But this time, I was not an empty-handed victim. I did not reply. The real shock arrived the following morning. I was walking through the lobby of my apartment building at 7 o'clock when I saw my mother standing near the concierge desk. Mary Ann Watson rarely ventured into downtown Seattle, preferring the manicured isolation of her lakeside community. She wore a tailored trench coat and held a silk scarf tight against her neck. She did not offer a hug. Her eyes darted nervously around the empty marble lobby. She looked at me and delivered a single, chilling sentence. "If you are planning to do something reckless tomorrow, you must think about the absolute consequences for the company." I stared at her. She did not say family. She said company. For years, I had assumed my mother was merely a passive bystander, a woman who looked the other way because she lacked a spine. But looking at her tightly drawn face, a new, much darker theory began to form. She was not just avoiding conflict. She was actively terrified of an investigation. Before I could ask a single question, she turned and walked out through the revolving glass doors. That cryptic warning sent me sprinting into a completely different direction. When I reached my desk at Grayline Benefit Systems, I pulled up the financial disclosures my father had circulated to the minority shareholders regarding the North Hollow acquisition. I had looked at them briefly before, but now I viewed them through the hyper-focused lens of a senior fraud analyst whose mother had just practically confessed to a corporate cover-up. I opened my dual monitors. On the left screen, I displayed the proprietary pitch deck highlighting Watson Ridge Outfitters' explosive Q4 sales growth. On the right screen, I began pulling publicly available interstate freight logs and commercial shipping manifests for the Pacific Northwest region. It took me roughly 3 hours of cross-referencing port authorities and way station data to find the catastrophic structural flaw. The sell-through data listed in the official valuation report did not match the physical movement of the goods. According to the pitch deck, our flagship retail locations were moving millions of dollars in premium outdoor gear, but the shipping data told a completely different story. Massive pallets of high-value inventory were not being sold to consumers. They were simply being shipped in continuous, circular loops between our central warehouse in Spokane and our secondary distribution center in Boise. It was a textbook phantom inventory scheme. They were logging internal transfers as completed point-of-sale revenue to artificially inflate the company's valuation right before the private equity buyout. I dug deeper into the digital signatures on the internal routing authorizations. The person signing off on these inflated circular transfers was not my father. It was the executive vice president. It was Blair. She had authorized dozens of phantom shipments, likely without even understanding the financial crime she was committing, blindly trusting whatever paperwork our father and the finance department placed in front of her. I immediately called Nora Kincaid on her encrypted line and walked her through the massive financial crater I had just uncovered. Nora was silent for a long moment. The stakes had just escalated from a bitter inheritance dispute to a massive business deception. Nora instructed me to draw a hard line between the two battlefields. She explained that front one was strictly about my honor, my bloodline, and the legacy trust. Front two was the falsified commercial data. She warned me that if I dropped the financial discrepancies into the middle of a probate discussion, it would cause absolute chaos and give Calvin's lawyers room to accuse me of corporate extortion. We had to keep them separate. However, she noted with a sharp edge in her voice, if he pushed me into a corner and refused to yield on the trust, the two fronts would inevitably collide. I spent the rest of the evening preparing for absolute war. I purchased 2 identical, heavy-duty manila envelopes. In the first envelope, I placed the certified, court-grade laboratory results confirming my biological parentage, complete with the chain of custody documentation. This was my shield. In the second envelope, I compiled a meticulous, 30-page dossier. It contained the timeline of the holiday dinner, the printed emails, the video transcripts, and a highly detailed spreadsheet mapping the circular inventory routing, complete with Blair's digital signatures. I did not explicitly write the word fraud anywhere in the document. I simply presented the conflicting data points as a series of severe operational questions that an external auditor would undoubtedly ask. This was my sword. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. I bypassed my usual corporate attire and selected a minimalist, sharp charcoal suit, no jewelry, no distracting colors. I looked like an investigator arriving for a scheduled audit. I placed both sealed envelopes into my structured leather briefcase. When I stopped by the office break room to grab a black coffee, Tessa was leaning against the counter, watching me with a mixture of immense respect and slight apprehension. She knew exactly where I was heading. She looked at my suit and the heavy leather bag. "He is walking into that boardroom expecting to completely destroy you," Tessa said quietly. I snapped the brass locks of the briefcase shut. The metallic click echoed sharply against the tile walls. "He wants a show," I replied, my voice completely stripped of emotion. "I am bringing the record." The conference room at the law offices of Ellis Rowan was designed to make visitors feel small. Located on the 42nd floor, it featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying, overcast view of the city. The air smelled of expensive leather upholstery and sharp citrus cleaning solvent. A massive slab of polished walnut served as the boardroom table, surrounded by 12 high-backed chairs. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment, perfectly suited for the execution of a corporate coup. My father sat at the absolute head of the table. He wore a navy bespoke suit, radiating the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he was about to win a war without firing a single shot. To his immediate right sat Ellis Rowan, our longtime family attorney, looking solemn and appropriately expensive. Blair sat to our father's left, her blonde hair perfectly styled, a fresh legal pad positioned precisely in front of her. My mother, Marianne, sat further down, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring intensely at a glass of sparkling water. A few other key internal players, including my Aunt Cynthia, the chief financial officer, occupied the remaining seats at exactly 10 in the morning. Ellis Rowan cleared his throat and called the room to order. Calvin immediately took the floor. He did not speak like a father addressing his family. He spoke like a ruthless executive closing a hostile takeover. "We stand on the precipice of a monumental transaction," Calvin announced, his deep voice bouncing off the frosted glass walls. "The North Hollow acquisition will secure this family for the next century, but to ensure the private equity transition proceeds without interference, we must fortify the foundation of this enterprise. We must protect the Watson legacy from any future baseless disputes regarding lineage and entitlement. We need a clean, unquestionable chain of command." He nodded to Ellis. The attorney adjusted his reading glasses, opened the thick leather-bound portfolio, and began to read the new legacy trust proposal aloud. The reading took nearly 10 minutes. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Save for the dry rustle of turning pages and Ellis's monotone voice, he navigated through dense thickets of legal jargon. Eventually, arriving at the crucial section, he read the restrictive covenants out loud. He explicitly detailed how all voting shares, board seats, and executive decision-making powers would henceforth be strictly limited to the verified lineal descendants and biological issue of the founder. Ellis finished reading the clause, closed the heavy folder, and looked up over the rim of his glasses. "Are there any formal objections or points of clarification before we move to notarize and execute the document?" I kept my hands flat on the table. I took a slow, measured breath, letting the absolute silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, I stood up. My charcoal suit felt like a suit of armor. I looked directly down the length of the table, locking eyes with my father. "Before we proceed," I said, my voice carrying the sharp, clinical cadence I used when presenting fraud findings to federal regulators, "I would like to introduce the woman sitting to my left. This is my retained legal counsel, Nora Kincaid, senior partner at Kincaid Mercer. She is here to represent my shareholder interests regarding this specific biological threshold." The temperature in the room plummeted. Blair's pen froze halfway across her legal pad. Marianne closed her eyes. Calvin's confident posture stiffened, his eyes darting quickly toward the unfamiliar woman who had entered quietly with me and sat near the back corner. I reached down and unlatched my heavy leather briefcase. The brass locks clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap. I bypassed the thicker second envelope containing the explosive financial shipping data. I reached in and pulled out the first manila envelope. I placed it flat on the polished walnut surface. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I pushed it forward. It glided effortlessly down the center of the long table, a perfect, haunting mirror image of the holiday dinner. It stopped exactly 3 inches from my father's folded hands. Nora Kincaid stood up. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the devastating, quiet authority of a predator who had just cornered its prey. "Contained within that envelope," Nora stated, addressing the entire room but keeping her gaze fixed on Calvin, "are the certified results from an independent, legally accredited forensic laboratory located here in the city. The document confirms conclusively that Ember Watson is the biological offspring of Calvin Watson. The probability of paternity is 99.99%. Nora paused, letting the numbers hang in the cold air. The collection followed strict, unbroken chain of custody protocols. The technician verified government identification. The results are fully admissible in both state and federal court. And the raw data is available for your own independent medical experts to verify, should you wish to waste your time challenging them." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, decade-long narrative disintegrating into dust. Calvin stared at the manila envelope as if it were a live incendiary device. His first reflex was pure, unadulterated denial. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson. The veins in his neck strained against the collar of his expensive dress shirt. "This is garbage," Calvin spat, his voice rising. breaking the professional decorum of the room. He slammed his open palm onto the table, making the water glasses rattle. "This is a fabricated stunt. You forged this paperwork to sabotage the North Hollow buyout because you are bitter about not being handed an executive title." I did not flinch. I let his outrage burn itself out and looked at him with a cold, almost clinical clarity. "There is no fabrication," I replied evenly. "I merely executed the exact legal directive you issued. I have the authenticated digital receipt of your explicit consent, sent directly from your secure executive email server. I have time-stamped video of you agreeing to these exact parameters, recorded by 2 separate witnesses on the night of our holiday gathering. I preserved the entire chain of events. The facts are insulated from your anger." Calvin let out a harsh, abrasive laugh. It was loud, meant to project absolute dominance, but it sounded hollow and panicked. He looked over at Ellis, expecting his high-priced lawyer to immediately tear my argument apart. "You think a piece of paper changes anything?" Calvin mocked, though his voice lacked its usual booming resonance. "You think this forces me to give you a seat at my table?" Ellis did not back him up. The older attorney was staring down at the drafted trust document in his own hands, his face completely drained of color. He saw the trap before Calvin did. Nora delivered the final, fatal blow, her tone laced with absolute professional disdain. "Actually, Calvin, you just did," Nora said smoothly. "By aggressively structuring this new legacy trust to strictly define voting rights and board presence based on verified lineal descendants. You have legally mandated her inclusion. You drafted a biological threshold specifically to lock her out, but because these certified results predate your signature, you just built the exact legal bridge that guarantees her a permanent, unassailable position at the absolute center of this company's power structure." The forced, mocking laugh died instantly in my father's throat. His mouth formed a tight, hard line. His eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. The very claws he had weaponized to erase me had just become the concrete foundation of my undeniable authority. Calvin refused to be backed into a corner. His entire empire was built on his ability to aggressively pivot when a deal went sour. He looked at the certified laboratory results resting on the mahogany table, then looked up at me, his face a mask of furious, rapid calculation. He slammed his fist down hard against the wood, the sudden noise acting as a harsh reset button for the room. "Fine," Calvin barked, his voice vibrating with a desperate, authoritative edge. "If we are establishing a biological baseline for this trust, we establish it across the board. Every single individual who expects to inherit a single share of Watson Ridge Outfitters will submit to the exact same court-grade genetic testing. Total transparency, no exceptions." He thought it was a brilliant power move. He believed that by turning his weapon on the entire room, he could regain control of the narrative and make my individual victory seem like a minor administrative hurdle. Blair immediately nodded in fierce agreement. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She believed entirely in her own pristine legacy. To her, this blanket policy was just a necessary, temporary inconvenience to finalize the North Hollow acquisition and secure her inevitable position as the sole heir. She wanted the commercial buyout to proceed on schedule, and she was more than happy to bleed a little to prove her supreme loyalty to the bloodline. 72 hours later, the entire family was summoned back to the exact same high-rise law office. The atmosphere was completely different this time. There was no smug superiority, only a thick, suffocating tension. Ellis Rowan, the family attorney, sat at the head of the table. He looked physically ill. A stack of sealed, identical manila envelopes rested neatly in front of his folded hands. Ellis opened the first envelope. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the dense medical jargon before landing on the final, unassailable conclusion. Blair Watson possessed a 0% probability of being the biological offspring of Calvin Watson. The explosion that followed made the previous confrontation feel like a minor disagreement. It was not a quiet shift in power. It was a catastrophic structural collapse. Blair dropped her expensive ceramic coffee cup. It shattered against the hardwood floor, dark liquid soaking into the intricate Persian rug, but nobody even glanced downward. The golden child, the manufactured face of the retail empire, the woman whose entire corporate identity was built on the absolute assumption of genetic supremacy, instantly shattered into pieces. Calvin lunged out of his heavy leather chair. He turned on my mother with a level of rage I had never witnessed before. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple as he screamed accusations that echoed off the frosted glass walls. Marianne dissolved into absolute, hyperventilating panic. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, completely unable to articulate a defense against the sudden exposure of a 37-year-old secret. I sat perfectly still, watching the violent destruction of the family hierarchy. Blair was crying so hard she could barely breathe, her perfect posture collapsing as the legal reality set in. According to the very trust document she had so eagerly supported just days prior, she was now legally disinherited. She was entirely severed from the executive future of the company, but the devastation was far from over. Later that same evening, I was sitting in my dimly lit living room when my encrypted phone rang. It was Nora Kincaid. She instructed me to open the secure portal we used for document sharing. A new file had just been uploaded. I received this an hour ago from a highly placed, sympathetic source inside the corporate accounting department at Watson Ridge, Nora said, her voice carrying a rare tone of genuine shock. It was buried in a digitized archive of executive discretionary spending. I opened the document on my laptop. It was a scanned copy of a heavily faded medical invoice from a discreet, private laboratory based in Oregon. The date printed at the top indicated the transaction had occurred exactly 12 years ago. The invoice was billed directly to the private accounts of Calvin Watson. I read the line items. The invoice was for a comprehensive, covert paternity analysis. The subject listed on the paperwork was Ember Watson. The air left my lungs. The glowing blue light of the screen illuminated the absolute, undeniable proof of my father's true nature. He knew. He had always known. 12 years ago, right around the time I graduated from university and began asking pointed questions about the operational mechanics of his company. He had quietly swabbed a hairbrush or discarded water glass. He had paid for the truth, and the truth had confirmed I was his legitimate child. This single piece of paper changed the entire architectural framework of our family war. Calvin was not a stubbornly suspicious father who had allowed a rumor to cloud his judgment. He was a deeply calculating man who had intentionally, maliciously maintained a slanderous lie for over a decade. He had actively allowed the family to mock me. He had weaponized my physical differences to keep me isolated and defensive, purely because he recognized that I possessed the analytical intellect to threaten his absolute control over the company. He needed me marginalized, and the lie was his most effective tool. Nora waited on the line, letting the gravity of the revelation settle. "If we introduce this into the legal proceedings tomorrow," she said quietly, "it will destroy him entirely. It proves premeditated malice. The private equity buyers will flee the moment they realize they are dealing with a CEO who actively orchestrates psychological warfare against his own legitimate shareholders." I looked at the digital invoice, my finger resting lightly on the trackpad. I thought about Blair, currently locked inside her luxury penthouse, watching her entire universe disintegrate because of a biological technicality she never saw coming. If I dropped this bomb on the family immediately, it would turn the ongoing crisis into a useless, chaotic, emotional massacre. Blair was already in freefall. I had no desire to inflict further, unnecessary collateral damage just to satisfy my own anger. "We hold it," I told Nora, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "We keep this entirely off the board for now. We let him scramble to manage the disaster with Blair. I am saving this invoice for the absolute final strike." I closed the laptop, the room plunging into darkness. I sat in the silence, my mind working through the tactical implications of the old invoice. But the deeper I analyzed the timeline, the more a massive, glaring logical inconsistency began to emerge. If Calvin had secretly known for 12 years that my DNA was an exact, undeniable match, why take the massive, catastrophic risk of challenging me publicly at that holiday dinner? He had to know that forcing me to take a verified test would eventually grant me the exact legal leverage he was trying to deny me. Why would a man who meticulously controlled every aspect of his empire deliberately hand his greatest corporate adversary the keys to the castle, right as a multi-million-dollar private equity buyout was about to be signed? The answer to the timeline discrepancy materialized on a massive glass whiteboard in Nora Kincaid's office. We spent the entire weekend mapping every single corporate maneuver my father had executed over the past 12 months. I stood back, holding a dry erase marker, watching the insidious logic of his master plan reveal itself in chronological order. He did not initiate the public challenge at the holiday dinner out of random cruelty. He did it because North Hollow Retail Partners was scheduled to open the final intensive due diligence data room exactly 2 weeks after the holiday. That was the exact window when the risk of aggressive external scrutiny regarding the company's operational metrics would peak. My father knew that as a minority shareholder with a background in corporate investigations. I possessed the legal right to review the financials before signing off on the buyout. He also knew I was the only person in the family capable of spotting the rot. He needed a highly public, emotionally devastating distraction. He needed to trigger a rapid sequence of events that would culminate in the execution of the new legacy trust, effectively stripping me of my voting shares and my access to the data room before the private equity auditors arrived. He gambled his entire empire on the assumption that my wounded pride would prevent me from demanding a court-grade test, or that he could finalize the legal paperwork before I ever received the results. He had simply miscalculated my absolute lack of sentimentality. With the motive finally clear, I turned my full attention back to the falsified commercial data. The circular inventory routing I had previously discovered was only a fragment of the overall deception. A phantom shipping scheme requires a willing partner to make the invoices look legitimate to an auditor. I dug deeper into the public freight registries and cross-referenced them with the limited vendor lists I possessed. I found the missing link operating out of a sprawling warehouse district in Portland, Oregon. It was a supposedly independent third-party logistics distributor. However, a quick search of state corporate filings revealed that my Aunt Cynthia, the chief financial officer of Watson Ridge, had previously served on their board of directors. They were running a classic channel stuffing operation. Our company was shipping massive volumes of unsold outdoor gear to this friendly distributor, booking the outbound freight as completed sales revenue to artificially inflate the fourth quarter valuation for the New York buyers. Weeks later, the inventory would quietly rotate back into our secondary warehouses under the guise of seasonal returns. I pulled up the digital signatures on the routing authorizations again. Blair's name was stamped across dozens of fraudulent transfers, but when I traced the internal communication pathways, the structural directives, and the final executive approvals always bypassed her, originating directly from the secure terminals of Calvin and Cynthia. A profound, chilling realization washed over me. Blair was not the mastermind. She was the perfect, oblivious shield. She had been raised in a gold-plated cage where the singular rule of survival was to blindly trust our father and sign whatever documents were placed on her immaculate mahogany desk. She was never taught to question the architecture of family power. If the federal authorities or the private equity firm ever uncovered the inflated revenue, the paper trail would lead directly to the executive vice president. Calvin had not only weaponized my genetics to keep me out, he had weaponized his golden child's absolute loyalty to set her up as the ultimate corporate fall guy. The final piece of the puzzle walked through the door of my apartment late on a Sunday evening. My mother, Mary Ann, stood in my entryway. She looked completely hollowed out, the pristine socialite facade entirely stripped away by the chaotic fallout of the past week. She did not ask for tea. She stood in my living room and finally spoke the unvarnished truth. She confessed that she had discovered the 12-year-old laboratory invoice hidden in the bottom drawer of his home office a decade ago. She knew he had secretly tested me. She knew I was his legitimate daughter. When I asked her why she had allowed him to maintain the psychological warfare for 10 years, her answer was perfectly aligned with the corporate conspiracy I had just uncovered. She explained that Calvin recognized my analytical mind very early on. He knew that if I was fully embraced as a legitimate Watson, my natural trajectory would land me near the financial core of the business. He could not afford to have an investigator inside his own house. He needed me permanently marginalized, locked in a perpetual state of defensive isolation, so he could maintain absolute, unchecked control over the corporate assets and his fraudulent schemes. The slander against my bloodline was never about my mother's fidelity. It was a calculated operational strategy to protect a massive financial crime. I now held 3 absolute weapons in my possession. First, the legal DNA results securing my undeniable authority. Second, the 12-year-old invoice proving my father's premeditated, decade-long malice. Third, the undeniable evidence of systemic financial fraud designed to deceive a major private equity firm. Sitting across from Nora the next morning, she laid out my options with clinical precision. We had enough ammunition to launch a nuclear strike. We could hand the fraud dossier directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the legal team at North Hollow. The acquisition would instantly collapse. Calvin and Cynthia would likely face federal indictments and potential prison sentences. The company would spiral into catastrophic bankruptcy, and the entire Watson legacy would be reduced to a cautionary tale in business journals. It was the ultimate revenge fantasy. It was the absolute destruction of the man who had tried to erase me. But I thought about the thousands of retail employees working in our stores across the Pacific Northwest. I thought about the warehouse workers, the store managers, and the logistics coordinators whose livelihoods depended on the survival of Watson Ridge Outfitters. I thought about Blair, who had just lost her entire biological identity and was currently sitting on top of a federal fraud trap she did not even understand. I am a senior fraud analyst. My profession is built on restoring order and exposing the truth, not burning down the entire building just to kill a single rat. I looked at Nora and shook my head. I chose a different path. I chose structured accountability. I was going to use my arsenal as leverage to force a complete and total surrender. I would not destroy the company, but I was going to make absolutely certain that my father paid a devastating public price for his survival. The final convergence took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in the primary executive boardroom of Watson Ridge Outfitters. This time, the audience was vastly different. Alongside my father, Ellis Rowan, and a visibly hollowed-out Blair, sat a phalanx of sharp-suited representatives from North Hollow Retail Partners. The private equity executives were completely unaware of the familial civil war that had detonated over the previous week. They were present to outline the final closing procedures. I did not take a seat. I stood at the far end of the long glass table, my hands resting lightly on the polished surface. I was not there to beg for a revised equity percentage or a meaningless corporate title. I was there to establish the new terms of reality. When the lead partner from North Hollow finished his opening remarks, I caught Nora Kincaid's eye. She offered a single, imperceptible nod. "Before any further signatures are authorized on this transaction," I began, my voice clear and projecting to the back of the room, "there are critical structural corrections that must be addressed regarding the governance of this enterprise." I unclasped my leather portfolio. I withdrew the certified court-grade laboratory results and placed them smoothly onto the table. Next to them, I laid down the 12-year-old medical invoice addressed directly to Calvin Watson. I pushed both documents toward the center of the table where the New York executives could clearly see them. "For the past 10 years," I stated, maintaining direct eye contact with my father, "the founder of this company has deliberately weaponized a fabricated narrative regarding my parentage. He utilized this slander to systematically exclude me from executive oversight. However, the invoice currently resting on the table proves that he covertly commissioned a genetic analysis over a decade ago. He knew I was his legitimate biological child the entire time. He maintained the lie purely to protect his absolute control over the financial operations." I turned my gaze toward Blair. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and guarded, bracing for me to publicly annihilate her with her own recent test results. I did not. The objective was never to trade one victim of biological manipulation for another. The fundamental issue here is not whose veins carry which specific genetic sequence, I said, ensuring my tone carried absolute conviction. The issue is that the chief executive officer has consistently utilized DNA as a blunt instrument to manipulate his family, to deceive his shareholders, and to set up his own executives to blindly sign authorizations they did not understand. The North Hollow representatives shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs. The lead partner frowned, sensing the severe legal turbulence rapidly approaching. Nora Kincaid stepped forward, seamlessly taking over the tactical execution. She outlined our immediate, non-negotiable legal conditions. First, the proposed legacy trust was to be suspended indefinitely. Second, the exclusionary bloodline clause would be permanently stricken from all current and future corporate governance frameworks. Third, Watson Ridge would submit to an immediate, fully independent operational audit to review specific regional shipping and inventory routing practices prior to the buyout closing. The mention of an independent audit was the killing blow. My father visibly recoiled. He knew exactly what the auditors would find in the Portland warehouse logs. The North Hollow lead partner stood up, his expression hardening into a mask of professional self-preservation. He formally announced that the private equity firm was instantly freezing the entire acquisition timeline. No funds would be transferred, and no contracts would be finalized until their own forensic accounting team completed a deep-dive investigation into the company's internal metrics. It was the exact nightmare my father had spent a decade trying to avoid. The absolute control he coveted, the pristine image he had curated for the business media, evaporated in a matter of seconds. To secure my silence regarding a public lawsuit, Nora drafted one final mandate. Calvin was legally compelled to author a formal letter of retraction. This was not a private apology. The mandate required him to send the correction to the exact same distribution lists he had previously utilized to humiliate me. 48 hours later, every member of the extended family group chat and the entire senior leadership tier of the company received a sworn statement from Calvin. He formally acknowledged me as his legitimate daughter and explicitly admitted that his previous comments regarding my lineage were entirely false and entirely unfounded. The fallout from the subsequent audit was swift and brutal. My Aunt Cynthia quietly stepped down from her position as Chief Financial Officer. Citing a sudden desire for early retirement, the North Hollow acquisition was eventually restructured at a significantly reduced valuation. Governed by a completely new, independent board of directors that effectively stripped my father of his unilateral authority, I received my rightful, unencumbered percentage of the voting shares. However, I had no desire to hoard the wealth of a toxic empire. I collaborated with Nora to liquidate a massive portion of my newly acquired assets. We established a fully funded charitable trust dedicated to providing advanced outdoor survival training and comprehensive educational scholarships exclusively for the frontline retail personnel who actually kept the company running. 6 months later, the corporate warfare felt like a distant memory. I hosted a small, intimate dinner party at my townhouse in Seattle. The atmosphere was completely different from the sprawling, performative holiday gatherings in Idaho. There were no assigned seats at the head of the table. There were no calculated speeches about legacy or genetic supremacy. Tessa Moreno sat near the kitchen island, laughing loudly as she poured out glasses of red wine. A few close colleagues from the fraud division occupied the sofa, arguing cheerfully about a recent documentary. The doorbell rang just after 8 o'clock. I opened the door to find Blair standing on my front porch. She looked different. The pristine, untouchable corporate armor was gone, replaced by a simple wool sweater and jeans. She held a slightly crushed bakery box in her hands. Apologizing nervously for the traffic on the interstate, I smiled, stepped aside, and invited her in. She walked into the warmth of my home, placing the rushed dessert onto the counter. I watched her integrate into the chaotic, genuine conversation happening around the room. I took a slow sip of my wine and felt a profound, quiet peace settle over me. For the first time in my entire life, I fully understood that I did not need a piece of paper, a corporate title, or an arrogant man's validation to know exactly where I belonged. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.